St. Anselm of Canterbury was an 11th century philosopher and theologian who became one of the most important thinkers of the medieval church. Born in Italy and later serving as Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm described his approach to philosophy as faith-seeking understanding. He believed that reason could help explain and deepen religious faith rather than replace it. His most famous contribution, the ontological argument, aimed to prove God's existence not through observation or evidence, but through pure logic. Unlike other arguments for God's existence, such as the cosmological argument which we encountered with Aquinas, the ontological argument doesn't rely on observation or experience. Instead, it tries to show, using reason and logic alone, that God must exist. In other words, it's an argument that starts not from the world around us, but from an idea in the mind. Anselm defined God as that being than which nothing greater can be conceived. In simpler terms, God is the greatest possible being. Nothing greater can be imagined. Anselm's reasoning goes like this. We can all understand the idea of such a being, even an atheist, but something that exists in reality is greater than something that exists only in the mind. To illustrate this, Anselm asks us to think of a painting. A painting that actually exists on canvas is greater than one that exists only as an idea in your head. So, if God existed only in the mind, we could imagine something greater, a God who exists both in the mind and in reality. But that would contradict the very definition of God as the greatest conceivable being. Therefore, Anselm concludes, God must exist both in thought and in reality. He later added a further point. A truly perfect being must not only exist, but exist necessarily. It's impossible for God not to exist. Everything else, people, planets and trees, is contingent, meaning it might not have existed. But God's existence depends on nothing else. God is necessary. However, soon after Anselm wrote his argument, another monk, named Gaunilo of Marmoutier, objected. In a work called On Behalf of the Fool, he argued that Anselm's reasoning could be used to prove the existence of almost anything. Gaunilo said, "Imagine the most perfect island you can conceive, perhaps an island with endless beauty, palm trees, golden beaches and gentle breezes. By Anselm's logic, this island must exist, because an island that exists in reality would be greater than one that exists only in your imagination. But clearly, imagining a perfect island doesn't make it real." So Gaunilo concluded that if Anselm's reasoning could be used to prove the existence of something as absurd as a perfect island, then the argument itself must be flawed. Anselm, however, did not ignore this criticism. In his reply, he argued that Gaunilo had misunderstood the kind of being to which the argument applies. His reasoning, Anselm said, concerns a necessary being, one that cannot fail to exist, not a contingent thing like an island. An island, by its very nature, would always be limited. It would have boundaries and could always be imagined as having more beaches, more palm trees, or a gentler climate. In other words, an island can always be improved. It can never be perfect in the absolute unlimited sense that defines God. God, however, has no limits. God is not a thing within the world, but the source of everything, a being that is infinite and necessary. So, Anselm argued, Gaunilo's perfect island objection is not as powerful as it might seem, because it compares something finite with something infinite. Even though Thomas Aquinas was also a theist, he rejected Anselm's argument. Aquinas thought the ontological argument assumed too much about what human beings can know about God. He argued that we cannot fully grasp God's nature. We don't truly know what ultimate perfection means, so we can't simply move from an idea in the mind to claim that such a being exists in reality. He also said that the statement, God exists, is not self-evident. It isn't true by definition. in the way that saying a triangle has three sides is true by definition. Instead, God exists is a claim about the world, and therefore it must be supported by evidence or experience, not by logic alone. For Aquinas, God's existence is something to be discovered through observation, through the effects we see in the world, such as motion and causation, not something that can be proven purely by analysing the idea of God. To understand Aquinas' point, it helps to look at two kinds of statement: analytic statements and synthetic statements. An analytic statement is true by definition. For example, a triangle has three sides. You don't need to check. The truth is built into the words themselves. A synthetic statement, on the other hand, adds something new to our knowledge and must be verified by experience. For example, the triangle is blue. You would have to look to see if that's true. Anselm treated God exists as analytic, true just by definition. But Aquinas said it's synthetic. It adds a claim about reality that cannot be known without evidence. In other words, existence isn't automatically part of the definition of God. You can't simply define something into existence. You have to show that it exists. Later philosophers, including Immanuel Kant, expanded this idea by arguing that existence isn't even a real predicate. It doesn't add anything new to the description of a thing. You can understand what a unicorn or a god is supposed to be without knowing whether either actually exists. Simply saying God exists doesn't make God real. Many centuries later, the 20th century philosopher Norman Malcolm returned to Anselm's idea and gave it a modern logical form. Malcolm agreed with Anselm that God must be a necessary being, one that depends on nothing else and cannot fail to exist. But he tried to clarify what this means. Everything in the universe is contingent. You and I exist because of our parents, planets exist because of physical laws, and everything that exists could, in principle, have failed to exist. But God is not like that. God wasn't caused by anything else, and his existence can't depend on anything else, for otherwise he would be subject to the same kind of contingency as everything else, and we would then have to seek an explanation for God's existence. Malcolm argued that there are only two logical possibilities for a being like God. Either God's existence is impossible, or it is necessary. There is no middle ground. If the very idea of God were contradictory, like a square circle, then God's existence would be impossible. But there's no contradiction in the concept of God. Thus, Malcolm concluded that God's existence cannot be impossible, and if it isn't impossible, then it must be necessary. Put simply, if God's existence is even possible, then God must exist. A necessary being, by its very nature, exists in every possible situation. It cannot fail to exist. So Malcolm's version of the ontological argument doesn't try to show how God exists, but rather that God cannot not exist. Although Aquinas objected to Anselm's version of the argument, his own argument from motion and argument from contingency both require a being that is not answerable to the causal laws of the universe, and in this sense there would seem to be some agreement in spite of Aquinas' objections. The universe is contingent, but there would appear to be the need for something to have created it in the sense that we would otherwise have to explain how whatever was responsible for its creation also came into being, and so on. The ontological argument remains one of the most fascinating attempts to use pure reasoning to prove that God exists. It challenges us to think about whether logic and language can bridge the gap between what exists in the mind and what exists in reality, and whether the very idea of a perfect being might, by its nature, demand to be real. But once again, if one acknowledges that faith is a central requirement of the Abrahamic religions, and that the Abrahamic God is simultaneously omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, then one needs to ask whether such attempts to prove the existence of God remain futile.